Hedley Thomas, the Australia's national chief correspondent, is an investigative journalist, author, and true crime podcaster. Hedley has won 8 Walkley Awards, including 2 Gold Walkleys. For his reporting in 2022, he received the Graham Perkin Award as Australia's Journalist of the Year. His first job in newspapers was as a copyboy on the Gold Coast Bulletin in 1984. Hedley worked as a journalist covering tumultuous news events in London, Europe, and Hong Kong for 8 years. He and his wife, Ruth, have lived in a semi-rural community near Brisbane since 1999. His investigations since 2017 have attempted to solve cold case murders of Australian women. Hedley pursued Chris Dawson for the 2018 smash hit podcast, The Teacher's Pet, leading to the former star footballer finally being found guilty 40 years after the 1982 murder of his wife, Lynn. His other podcasts are Shandee's Story, Shandee's Legacy, The Night Driver, The Teacher's Trial, and The Teacher's Accuser. His first book was Sick to Death, published in 2007. Hedley's podcasts have received over 100 million downloads and have topped charts in Australia, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand.
Welcome to episode 37 of the Normalist podcast. This is Hedley Thomas.
Hey Hedley, nice to meet you, mate.
You too. Good to see you. I hadn't taken into account. I'd forgotten that there's going to be there's some guys on the roof doing solar panels. Yeah. Well, I was going to say, if you like, I could go out in the car to a short distance.
Yeah, sure.
Whatever. Have a very
best. Yeah.
Hi. So now you've got the backdrop of my you got the backdrop of the car now, mate. Right.
Regardless of the backdrop, having you on the podcast, Hedley, blowing smoke up your ass. This is a real honor for me to have a chat with you today. And I've listened very intently to a lot of your podcast series, in particular, The Teacher's Pet and The Teacher's Trial, Shandee's Story, and more recently, Bronwyn. So thanks for giving up your time today.
Mate, thank you. And I do respond well to flattery, but that was very kind. I appreciate it. I don't know how it's happened that an old dog like me who's always been doing print reporting has been able to develop a following and pretty loyal and committed listenership to podcasts. But there you go.
At the forefront of that is kind of how your investigative journalism has transformed the way we look at all of these cold case murders of women in Australia. You have this relentless pursuit of justice, and you can tell in the passion you have for what you do. What is it that drew you to investigative journalism in your early years? Do you want to take us back to when you started as a journalist?
Yeah. Look, almost all journalists now enter the profession, or the craft, as some people call it, with a tertiary education. They've been to university. They've been schooled in all sorts of things that when I left high school at the end of 1984 on the Gold Coast, I didn't understand. And when I started at the Gold Coast Bulletin as a copy boy with the promise of a cadetship if I didn't screw up in the first 6 or 9 months as copy boy, I just thought, wow, wouldn't it be great to be a reporter covering general news and police incidents, maybe even serious crimes, whatever was happening in my community. I didn't properly appreciate or understand the potential with investigative journalism, but I credit my mum and my dad in particular. I can still remember being a teenager. I'd recently become a cadet, and I was working in the sports section of the Gold Coast Bulletin because they probably thought that's where I should start. I had a keen interest in sport, and my old high school where Chris Dawson taught was powering in rugby league, and they'd become newsworthy. My school of Kebra Park State High. And Dad said, "Oh, pal, when do you think you might think about investigative journalism?" It just seemed like such a faraway thing, this um, almost unattainable um, ideal. And, so typical of my dad to sort of raise the bar a little bit higher. I was just glad to get the job as a journo, and here he was saying, "Well, when are you going to be like Chris Masters?" But it was a very fortuitous time to become a journalist in Queensland in the 1980s, because what we saw in the second half of the 80s was some incredible investigative journalism by Chris Masters and by Phil Dickey from the Courier Mail. And it just, whether you were intending to sort of take lessons from it or not, it must have influenced so many young reporters. It certainly influenced me in realizing that for many years, our criminal justice system had been completely bent. Our senior police, all the way up to the commissioner, Sir Terence Lewis, a knight, was on the take. They were on the take, stealing money from the community, being paid bribes by brothel owners and casino operators and all sorts of, shadowy criminals. And we had always suspected this, I think, as a community, but no really serious journalism had exposed it until they came along. And those events, they have to have influenced a generation of young journalists to no longer just accept the trotted out spin and lies of government officials and ministers and other people in authority.
It seems like with this case in particular, the Chris Dawson case, given there was no body, there was no admission from Chris, and there was no real DNA evidence, clothing, blood, of anything of that nature. So it's quite a massive landmark case in the history of Australia and investigative journalism. Do you understand, I guess, the responsibility that you have as a journalist and the role you have to play now, and I guess the way that these cases proceed moving forward, and what such an influence you've had in the landscape in Australia, but also across the world, given how broad and far wide the podcast spread?
Yeah, I do feel the burden of responsibility there, and I think that it's a privilege and honor, as well as a bit of a weight. It depends on who you talk to, though, in terms of my role in the investigation of Chris Dawson and the influence of the teacher's pet. A lot of fair-minded lawyers and judges and retired judges, for example, and we're talking now about representatives of the criminal justice system, they acknowledge to me, as well as senior police, they acknowledge this too, that if it hadn't been for the podcast, there wouldn't have been, in their view, a conviction, perhaps not even a prosecution proceeding. But then you get others who say, "Oh, yeah, but his podcast and the way he, took the way he spoke to so many witnesses who would have been key witnesses for the Crown, that almost blew the whole thing up. He could have ruined it. He almost did ruin it. It was lucky that it proceeded the way it did." So you get this kind of, division in terms of the way my role is perceived. I think the listenership and most people who are not lawyers and who just, use their common sense and look at, what happened, the chronology of events and so on, they have a view that there wouldn't have been a prosecution, and that it took the teacher's pet to really jolt the system to do the right thing after letting Lynn down for so many years. But I am aware that it's not universal.
Yeah. Now, we're not going to go into detail about all the implications of the Chris Dawson case, because we'd need, just like you did with the teacher's pet, 30, 40 weeks worth of content to do so. So I recommend anyone that's listening to this podcast, if you haven't already, the Teacher's Pet podcast is back on Spotify now. You can access that. There's also the Teacher's Trial. I thoroughly recommend, if you are listening to this now and you haven't listened to Hedley's podcast series, pause this podcast, jump across to that one, get a bit of an insight. It'll help you when you listen to this, understanding a bit of context behind what Hedley's saying. But he was sentenced on the 30th of August, 2022, was guilty of the murder of his wife, Lynette Dawson, and he's sentenced to 24 years in prison by Justice Ian Harrison. And on the 14th of September last year, he was also sentenced by Sarah Huggett for carnal knowledge, a girl between the ages of 10 to 17. And so Dawson actually pleaded that he couldn't get a fair trial because of the podcast, the Teacher's Pet podcast itself. Did you ever have any concerns or worries at any point that, because of the work you had been doing and the amount of hours and countless investigation and interviews that you did with different family members, police, other specialists, did you ever have a concern that it would all fall through on the basis that Chris couldn't get a fair trial?
I had a huge concern about that. Yeah, I was very worried through 2019 and 2020 that the efforts of so many people to help me, the efforts that I had gone to, and the risks that I'd taken, my employer had taken, legal risks, editorial risks, journalistic risks, would all end up being effectively traduced, and that he would be able to rely on the product, the podcast, which we believe led to him being charged in the first place, being the thing that gave him the escape strategy. It was an awful proposition, to contemplate that. It just used to leave my guts churned, and I would be unnerved pretty much every time his lawyers made a further demand for material or made a statement on television or to media conferences. They often did after some of the preliminary proceedings, in which they took the opportunity to have a swing at the Teacher's Pet, the podcast, and me, and so on. And I just thought, oh, God, when are we actually going to be able to get through all of this and into the nitty-gritty and the questions over his probable guilt? I was in no doubt that he was a cold-blooded murderer and that he was spending a lot of money on very effective legal representation. That's his right. And of course, there is this, presumption of innocence. I didn't presume him innocent, though. So, I'm not going to lie. I presumed him utterly guilty. I tried to give him his side of the story in the podcast, and he decided that he didn't want to talk. So I did the best thing I did the next best thing I could. I tried to present his side of the story through the lawyering by his brother, Peter, from when Peter was in an inquest on behalf of Chris and Chris's twin brother, Paul. And, I was also looking for people who knew Chris personally who might speak on his behalf. And one of those was a mate of mine called Scott Sattler, who had been at Coomba State High on the Gold Coast, fantastic rugby league player. And Chris and Paul Dawson had helped mentor Scott. And so Scott was talking on Chris's behalf. But overwhelmingly, the Teacher's Pet, was a very focused and, I think, evidence-based examination of a case that was so strongly circumstantial in pointing to his guilt that it just was incredible for me and so many other people that he had never been charged. And I couldn't make a 50-50 kind of
Yeah.
story about Chris Dawson. I couldn't. There was not enough. There wasn't nearly enough material to even get to like 80-20 representation, and that's not my fault, it's his. He was just guilty from the get-go.
Did you ever struggle with this? I guess the how sensitive the investigations were.
What I struggled with after I'd done several episodes and after I had um, uncovered more evidence and talked to more people, I struggled with the traditional convention, the need for journalists to maintain balance, to try to be objective and not form, a hard and fast view. I I couldn't rationally, logically maintain objectivity or be balanced when it came to Chris Dawson because I couldn't see any evidence that gave me comfort that perhaps he was an innocent man. It just didn't exist. So, um, and I think that sometimes in journalism and perhaps the perception of audiences is that journalists ideally really have to never kind of form that view. They just have to be the messenger. That's ridiculous. We're not robots. We're all influenced by uh, um, our education, our cultural values, our upbringing, our relationships, and what we regard as being capable of passing the pub test of what's believable, what's credible. And to me, it was never likely that Lynn had just decided to start a new life after telling Chris she was going to change some clothes on a shopping trip, and she's wearing a pair of pink shorts and has got very little dough and leaves behind her girls and a house worth almost 300 grand.
Yeah.
That was just stupid. But as I got more into the case and more involved, it became even more stupid, that idea. And so I found it increasingly difficult to avoid the what some people referred to as the sound of righteous anger as I was narrating and telling the story and interviewing people. I took a side. I really did. But by the same token, this was a case that when I started investigating, it was 36 years old. Dawson had got away with murder for 36 years, and a case so old, it demanded pretty front-footed, robust investigative journalism to make a difference. If I had gone into it and finished it with timidity, with punches pulled and ticking all the boxes of theoretical fairness and balance that perhaps some of the armchair experts would have preferred, well, I think Dawson would still be living the life in his beachside house on the Sunshine Coast, and this woman and her family would have still been searching for justice and knowing they'd never ever get it. This was the last chance. So we took risks. We really pushed the envelope, and thankfully the system finally kicked in and worked.
The new series you're working on, Bronwyn, were you amazed how similar, say, John and Chris Dawson, I was just amazed how similar their stories were.
Yeah, that is striking a lot of people who have listened to The Teacher's Pet and who are now deep into the Bronwyn podcast. The parallels, I guess I have to be a bit careful in making too much of the parallels, because if they are identical, then that makes John an unconvicted murderer. And I'm not saying that. I'm obviously of a view that he's the recommendation of the former Deputy State Coroner, Karl Milovanovich, that he be prosecuted over Bronwyn's alleged murder should have been adopted by the DPP, and I think it still can be, but um, there are, eerie similarities in these cases.
On
Thank
that
you.
on that topic, mate, when we talk about how difficult it was in some circumstances for you to kind of remain impartial with different cases, the case against John Peros, who's a suspected murderer of his previous girlfriend, Shandee. I imagine when you have the evidence of the white Hilux, the blood, the CCTV footage of that white shadow sprinting across the top of the street there from the surveillance camera. When you have cases like that where there's just this overwhelming sense of evidence that John is guilty, I can imagine it is particularly hard for you to avoid taking sides.
I think with Shandy's story, it was complicated by a couple of other issues that made me really want to be so careful in the way I presented the story. And those issues were that although police and Shandy's family and, the Crown, the prosecutor in Queensland, believed that John was guilty of Shandy's murder, he had not only vehemently denied that, but when it went before a jury in a murder trial in Mackay in 2017, they acquitted him in a very short period of time. And, that was sort of fact number one. Now we can debate whether or not they reached the right verdict, but that was the verdict they reached. So he had actually been held accountable, and the jurors said, we can't get to, the level that is needed, or I don't know, who knows how they deliberated and what they went. Yeah. Maybe they believed that there was just no case whatsoever to answer. We don't know. And then what we had after a period of 2 years and a lot of concern in the community of Mackay about this case that hadn't been resolved was an inquest run by a local coroner, a very senior magistrate. And that inquest heard a lot of evidence that was not heard by the jurors in John's murder trial. And the coroner, acting as a senior law officer, ended up delivering a finding, a very detailed judgment that John had actually killed Shandee, that he had done it. And you had this very interesting tension then between two parts of the criminal justice system and two completely different outcomes. And into that, I really wanted to explore how the jurors, or how the trial had unfolded, how the murder had taken place, how the coroner had come to his view, and try to be as open-minded as possible given the different outcomes. And I was probably also still thinking as well that at that time that I was doing Shandy's story, Chris Dawson was awaiting trial. That was inching towards trial. I was mindful of the criticisms that had been made of me and of the teacher's pet over the way that had unfolded. So I was probably just being super careful with that case in not making any sweeping statements or unsupported, unsubstantiated statements about John. And as a result, I think we ended up getting an incredibly important and extraordinary outcome, being findings and evidence and now huge reforms funded by more than $100 million because of our discovery with Dr. Kirsty Wright, who helped me, that the Queensland Forensic Lab, the DNA testing laboratory for all crime, serious crime in Queensland, was a basket case and had been for years, and had failed thousands of victims of crime, including Shandee, in terms of identifying the perpetrators, rapists and murderers and other very serious, the worst possible criminals. And so, you know, I don't sort of step back from the Shandee story and say we identified a killer, someone other than John or even John. What we identified in Shandee's story was everything that we believed was in the public interest and relevant in that case. But more than that, we exposed a corruption in the most important part of the forensic science. It's the worst forensics disaster in the world, according to Dr. Kirsty Wright, and it would not have ever been known if it hadn't been for her efforts and our joint kind of determination to keep exposing it and keep digging with that podcast series. It's going to have a long tail too. You know, the legacy will be many, many more people who would otherwise have got away with their crimes getting arrested. And, you know, it's just happening. People are getting arrested and charged with serious crimes as a result of the realization by the system that should have known better that they were doing it wrong, that they were failing to detect DNA that was always there. And, you know, people talk about, well, do true crime podcasts, you know, really make a difference? Do they get in the way? Do they hinder or do they help? You look at the findings that have come out of the Shandee Story podcast in relation to Queensland's lab and the impact on so many people, positive impact as a result, when, you know, the smartest people in the room, the judges, the prosecutors, the defense lawyers, the senior police, the scientists, they had all utterly failed to appreciate that their own system was broken. Their forensic testing system was broken. And, you know, in many ways, the outcomes from that podcast, because they affect so many cases, retesting of tens of thousands of samples now going back some 15 odd years, and changes to the testing for, you know, for years to come that wouldn't have come about were it not for what was discovered in that podcast series, and all of the benefits that will then flow to victims of crime who would never have seen justice. It kind of, you know, when we talk about the individual cases that are really important, you know, Bronwyn and Lynn and Janine Vaughan in the night driver, they're so important as single cases. But we are talking about potentially hundreds and hundreds of cases that are going to be rectified, fixed up because of this one podcast, Shandee's story and Shandee's legacy.
Yeah, so I was reading the first page of the report so before we came on air, and I'll put that in the show notes so people can read the report from the Commission of Inquiry into the forensic DNA testing in Queensland. But that in 2022, 6th of June, as you say, Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk, she launched an independent commission into inquiry into the forensic DNA testing in Queensland. The inquiry was established to ensure transparency, identify opportunities for improvement, and ensure public confidence in the collection of DNA and testing and the analysis undertaken in Queensland in the criminal justice system more broadly. This inquiry was conducted by former President of the Court of Appeal, retired Judge Mr. Walter Sofronoff. In terms of his background, I understand he's got a really strong track record in terms of the work he's done. Can you tell us a little bit about, I guess, how we got to that point and what the future holds for Shandee's legacy, given that report?
Yeah. Before there was the inquiry, before the then Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk agreed that there should be a public inquiry, we in the podcast had been calling for it for weeks and weeks over multiple episodes, and we were just seeing more and more evidence that would justify it. It was piling up. And, I was saying to Kirsty, when we'd catch up for a cup of tea or, to talk about where things are at, what's your view about how bad this looks? And she's a very, very good, highly experienced, forensic biologist who's work in this field in DNA, is second to none. She's like a dog with a bone, and she's so gutsy. And she said, Hedley, I've never seen anything like it. It's corrupt. It's letting down so many people. And I can't believe that there isn't an outcry, a much bigger public outcry over what we are showing. They're not saying we've got anything wrong. They're just not saying anything. They're trying to make it go away. And I had the same view. And it was so concerning that very senior politicians were believing the garbage that they were being told by bureaucrats who were just trying to cover their ass and purport internally with misleading briefing notes that what Kirsty and I were talking about wasn't right, that there were other explanations and so on. We didn't see these. I didn't dare do it publicly because I would have called it all out and forced them to provide evidence for their baseless spin. But it was really worrying that we weren't seeing from government the proper response. In my experience as a journalist, and I've been around a lot of important yarns and seen the response of government to serious, significant revelations, there is a public inquiry usually called, and it doesn't take that long, and we can see lots of different types of inquiry. Sometimes they're large ones, such as a Royal Commission style inquiry. Sometimes they're relatively modest and still effective. But in this, we weren't hearing anything. It was just crickets. And it's a testament to Kirsty and to our joint commitment that we just decided, well, stuff this. We're just going to double down. We're not going to let them off. And the turning point came when there was a media conference out at a place called Pinkenbar, which is near Brisbane Airport. I think it's Pinkenbar. And the Premier was opening a cruise ship terminal there. And I don't go to media conferences unless they're directly related to a story that I'm dealing with. And I remember I was still in my pajamas at home. I was trying to get that episode out, and Lydia Lynch, one of my colleagues from the Australian, she'd given me a heads up that the Premier was going to be at this media conference, and Lydia was following the podcast so closely, and I could tell that she was suggesting that perhaps she and I could form this sort of flying wedge and jointly ambush the Premier. And instead of, asking banal questions about this cruise ship terminal out the back of Whoop Whoop, we could hammer her instead about the government's utter failure to address the DNA scandal that we were exposing in the newspaper and in the podcast. And so I said, okay, no worries. I'll shower and shave and get out of my jammies and see you out there. And we proceeded to ask a number of, direct and very penetrating questions of the Premier in front of the rest of the media, and also the VIPs and other people who'd been invited to sort of see this ribbon cutting ceremony that would have been, otherwise fairly lackluster. And it's actually, I don't know whether you do this in your podcast, but it might be worth, if you like, I can tell you which episode and give you a time code for it.
Yeah,
Just we
sure.
recorded it, and I think it's one of the most um it was high stakes, and certainly there was grumbles from some of the people there that we had effectively, you know, um, uh, tarnished their special occasion, after years of COVID and so on, and these cruise operators were so proud of their new terminal, and here's a couple of journos from the Australian who didn't want to talk about the terminal. They wanted to talk about the government's failure in addressing a DNA scandal. But it was a really effective push that we made, and it was within, I think, an hour and a half, maybe even less, of our questions being directed at the Premier, that the first seeds for the public inquiry were being sown. She was on the phone to her senior advisors, to her Attorney General, and they were working out how were they going to address this, that, there was no escape. They were getting it in the podcast, they were getting it in the paper, and now we were turning up at a press conference and asking questions about things that she didn't want to answer. And so that was the turning point. That's how we got that inquiry that really then began an excoriating process of vindicating what we'd been saying in the podcast, and showing so much more about what was literally the corruption of science in that laboratory.
How did she fend off the questions? Was it just a lot of roundabout answers?
Well, she did her best, and I, looking back, probably think that um, she wasn't herself to blame.
Yeah.
She, like the health minister and the attorney general, were being given really dodgy, really misleading advice by others, public servants, for their own reasons. And this is often the way in the public service and in state governments, and no doubt the federal government. Ministers will they need honest, independent, fearless advice from public servants. But if those public servants fear that they've got a target on their back, because if they give the honest, fearless advice, it means they've completely screwed up. If they say, Minister, yeah, look, we think those journalists have actually discovered that we may be sitting on the world's worst forensics disaster. Yeah, doesn't look great. Then it's their jobs or their KPIs or their futures potentially on the line. So I think a number of public servants just lied through their teeth to try to protect their own roles and reputations. And, it was quite disgusting, really.
So now, kind of change of pace, Hedley. We're just talking a little bit about the Bronwyn series that you've now kind of commenced. I understand there's some really important developments in that case where I think some witnesses have actually come forward and alluded to the chance there was a body wrapped up in sheets within the back of a car. Can you tell us a little bit more about that case, or that series with Bronwyn, and also kind of where you're at with that and where that's heading at the moment?
Absolutely. With Bronwyn Winfield's disappearance in 1993, there were no witnesses to what actually happened apart from her estranged husband, John. And he says that he didn't see where she went. He just claimed that on a Sunday night, May 16, 1993, she decided that she needed to have what he called a few days away as a break. They were going through their own very difficult domestic situation. They'd separated. She'd moved out of the house when she wanted to leave him, and she took the two girls, and she was looking after them in rented accommodation. So he stayed in their house in Lennox Head near Byron Bay, and Then he decided that he would go to Sydney because there was some good work for him in Sydney. So he left the house. And when he left the family home, he changed the lock so she couldn't get back into it. But she was doing it pretty tough financially. Um, he was not noted for being generous with money, and she was on a very tight budget when they were living as husband and wife. Things were worse when they were separated. So she decided she couldn't actually afford to keep renting downtown and that there was an empty family home. He wasn't living in it. It was nuts that she was going to keep paying rent in Byron Street, Lennox Head. So she, on a Friday night, moved back into their house and settled the girls and through the weekend kept moving stuff in. And on the Sunday evening, she was um, just expecting, no doubt, that her daughters would go to school the next morning, Monday. She had an appointment to see her solicitor for more advice about the separation that she and John were going through and how they would be able to settle things like ownership or proceeds from the sale of property and who would get the car and who would get the spoons and the lounges and all that sort of stuff. So that was her plan. She had an 11 a.m. appointment with her solicitor on the Monday. But on the Sunday evening, John flew back from Sydney and he came back, it seems, because of his concern that she was back in the house which had had its locks changed by him to prevent that happening. And as a result, we know that they had a disagreement. We don't know to what extent, but we know it was a disagreement because he has said that. Um, we don't know what happened next other than his version is that she went away. She got into a car that pulled up outside. He says that she'd made a couple of telephone calls from the bedroom, and then soon afterwards, a car came. And he says that's the last he saw of her, and no one's ever seen her since. Um, and we don't know. Sorry, let me repeat that. Let me change that. Until recently, there were no witnesses apart from a neighbor called Murray who described seeing John's car driving down the street at 10:40 p.m. that night with its engine off and its lights off. Fairly unusual way to leave a house and a downhill street, but that's what was happening. That's what Murray witnessed. John drove to Sydney through the night with the girls, turns up in Sydney the next morning. It wasn't expected. People were surprised when he turned up. He'd left the house in disarray. And then when neighbours went into the house a couple of days later, they discovered that it didn't appear Bronwyn had taken anything, makeup and clothing and so on. It didn't appear to be a trip that she'd well planned, if indeed it had happened at all. So, a lot of the neighbours and family members became suspicious, but they didn't really know what was going on. And then for the next 31 years, the case just went through different stages of, well, for the first 5 years, actually not really being taken seriously at all by local police. They just believed that Bronwyn must have been a bad wife and mum who decided to, take off with next to nothing, leaving behind the house and never contacting her kids again. And I think most reasonable people know that that is such a dumb idea. The idea that mothers without, um, serious drug addictions, without any other serious factors in their life, just decide one morning or evening to take off and never contact anybody again and not come back for anything. It's not to say it's not normal is, a huge understatement. It's just absurd in my view. But very recently, as a result of the podcast, a woman called Judy Singh contacted me, and she was a near neighbor. And in 1993, late at night, and we're very confident that it was the night that Bronwyn disappeared, Judy Singh was sitting on her balcony, and she was worried about things in her own life. She was concerned that she was going to miscarry the child that she was several months pregnant with. She was worried about how she was going to make ends meet with her um, marriage having fallen apart, and she had two children already who were dependent on her. She knew, but not well, Bronwyn and John, and she was sitting out late at night, just reflecting on, these worries and thinking about, what she might be able to do to get out of this mess that she felt she was in. She also had health issues. So her balcony looked down onto Granite Street, and Granite Street runs off Sandstone Crescent, very close to John and Bronwyn's house. And from that balcony, you have this almost bird's eye view into passing cars. And Judy says that very late at night, she thinks it might be around midnight, she saw and heard John's car coming down the street with its lights on. So it was a different trip to the one that Murray witnessed earlier. And that it was going very slowly, and unusually the interior light was on in the car. And as a result of the interior light being on in the car, she could see John very clearly driving. And she said he looked up because there was a lantern on the balcony where Judy was sitting, and she was looking down and seeing John. But then she says that she saw something which haunted her then and has haunted her for 3 decades. It was what appeared to her to be a body wrapped like a mummy, an Egyptian style mummy, in what appeared to be sheets or a sheet in the back seat. And she's given a very vivid description of this. I've interviewed her a couple of times, and we've filmed her describing this. And, in my opinion, she's compelling, credible, deeply troubled by what she saw. Instinctively, she believed that it was really a body. She said you could see the outline of the head wrapped up by the sheet. And the head and neck were sort of pushed into the corner of the back seat behind the front passenger seat, where the back seat meets the framework of the car. And the torso and legs were sort of stretching out towards the center console. And when she discovered from other neighbors that Bronwyn had gone missing, and that's why there were some police in the street, Judy went to the local police station in Ballina and told police about what she'd seen. And she said they couldn't have been less interested, which was consistent with what other people have told us about the response of police, that they were hopeless, really quite lacking in curiosity, not identifying or thinking about, it seems, many red flags that were flying in relation to the disappearance of Bronwyn. I mean, it became obvious very soon she wasn't touching bank accounts. So if she was alive and living independently, how was she funding herself? She didn't have money. She had a part-time job. She didn't turn up for that. She didn't turn up to see her kids again, and she didn't meet the appointment with the solicitor. In fact, she rang her solicitor on the Sunday afternoon. Very unusual thing to call your solicitor, at least back then, after hours on a weekend at home, to tell him of her concern that her husband was returning to the house. Bronwyn had previously talked to other friends about her fear of John. She had described, and we've heard this from a woman called Denise Barnard, who said that Bronwyn talked about how John had wrapped his hands around her throat and squeezed her throat, and she was really, really worried about, what he was potentially capable of. So as a result of Judy Singh coming forward and me interviewing her at length and using that in episode 7 of the podcast, we saw police who had all but given up on the case take a renewed interest, and 2 detectives from the Unsolved Homicide Squad in Sydney flew to Coolangatta and went and met Judy. They interviewed her at length, took a statement from her, which is all she'd wanted to do 31 years ago. And then she'd wanted to do it subsequently too. She'd also gone to Byron Bay Police with a New Zealand doctor she'd befriended. She hadn't seen that doctor in years. And when I was trying to corroborate what Judy was talking about, I tracked the doctor down and she remembered it and said, yeah, we went. And I believed her. She was telling the truth in my view. She was sure of what she saw. So the police now will put more effort, I'm sure, into attempting to reconstruct what Judy has described. John will continue to deny, as he always has, any wrongdoing. And he has also been through an inquest that occurred in 2002, 1 year before the inquest that Carl Milovanovich held for Lynn Dawson's presumed death. Really interesting that it was the same coroner in both inquests. And in fact, it was that coroner who first told me about Bronwyn's case back in December 2017 when I was interviewing him for The Teacher's Pet. And you can hear his voice in The Teacher's Pet series, but he told me something back then which I didn't use in The Teacher's Pet. He told me about these cases involving missing women who had disappeared under really suspicious circumstances, and yet possibly because of the culture at the time, the police hadn't done their jobs properly and hadn't investigated these cases as possible homicides. They just treated them as missing people. And Carl was concerned about that in the 2000s. And he said there were many of these cases. And he told me about the Bronwyn Winfield case briefly. He just said that he'd run this other case. That was the start for me of an interest in Bronwyn's case. So that goes back to 2017. And I did a number of interviews over the years between then and now, but I was never able to get the clear air I needed to do a proper, really committed investigation without interruption and distraction from other ones.
As I've been sitting here, Hedley, and listening to you talk there about Bronwyn's series, it's really compelling. Really, as we talked about earlier in the podcast, it's so eerie how similar both these cases, that Chris Dawson and John in this case. So, as you said, they're the same coroners, ultimately, which told you about Bronwyn's case. The same coroners, both men very tight with their budgets. So I understand Chris kept Lynn basically stranded in Bayview. She couldn't drive anywhere, up on the top of the hill. I've actually been up Winga Drive with my partner, and we went and had a look at where it was situated, and so high up. Even if you were a good driver, it's almost hard to navigate some of those slopes and streets. So but so tight with their budgets, and Chris with his money too was very, he constrained Lynn, and in a similar circumstance here, but also the issues with the family home. So a large part of Chris's case was the reason for Lynn's death was because Chris didn't want to sacrifice his property, or he didn't want to give up his share to Lynn. And so there was one point there when he was with JC, he wanted to move to a flat in Manly, and he was talking to his brother about, what would happen if they were to divorce, what share of the property would go to whom, how much he would lose out if they were to divorce. So again, similar circumstance there with the issues with the property and tempers as well. So we know Chris had a very large temper in the back, like there was instances where witnesses said in the backyard, he had Lynn up against a wall, like screaming at her with his arms around her throat, very similar to John's case as well. When both women vanished, there was this betrayal that they had just run away from their kids, yet they were both portrayed by friends and family as very loving, doting mothers. The credit card transactions, no credit card transactions on both sides. Bronwyn hadn't taken anything when she supposedly left. Lynn hadn't taken anything. All of her jewelry and handbags and clothing was still situated exactly where they were. Police weren't interested. The same thing occurred. I understand that the police at the time where Chris went to report Lynn missing had some form of connection with the Newtown Jets. And so there was, potentially some form of cover up in that respect. But it really is eerily similar in these two instances. And I don't know whether it's just a matter of coincidence or potentially like a generational issue among men and the treatment of women, which I think is a really important thing that you're addressing through these podcasts.
Thank you. I think it's combination of those, and we've learned so much as a society since the 90s and 2000s about the propensity of mostly male partners. Of course, there'll be some female partners who will do this too, but males to kill their spouse and then go to pretty elaborate lengths to conceal that crime. In Chris's case, that's been fully exposed now, although we have to speculate about some aspects of it because he hasn't owned up to it. He hasn't told us where Lynn's remains were disposed of. And I think what we've also learned as a society is that women don't just pack up without warning and leave behind really important parts of their lives. In particular, children. There's a bond between the overwhelming majority, of mums and their kids that prevents them from doing that. It's a very, very powerful, instinctive connection that women have, and it takes unusual, exceptional circumstances to sever that link permanently. And we should have always understood that and been suspicious of these sorts of cases, but they were just put in the too hard basket by police. There would have no doubt been pretty glib, smooth talking husbands. And certainly in Dawson's case, he did have that football connection. He had star appeal. He had charisma. After he'd finished playing with the Newtown Jets, he was a bit of a hero on the Northern Beaches and played footy with the Belrose Eagles, one of the senior detectives on the Northern Beaches, helped run that club. It had even helped recruit Chris and Paul Dawson after their first grade Newtown Jets careers to play for Belrose. So, the old mates act, we're all blokes, it was part of that culture, no doubt, but doesn't exist today. I think today, thankfully, if a woman disappeared, uh, it would be very quickly uh, a social media um, concern, and then no doubt a mainstream media and police concern, and they would be immediately or soon afterwards checking the house, the car, phone records, bank accounts, getting warrants to intercept communications between husband and wife on text and so on, and to work out what the relationship looked like. The other thing we've come to understand is that when um, bad men are going through separations with the partner, that's when she's at her most vulnerable. There's this there's this quite unhinged belief or determination in some men that what they own, what they believe they outright own, insofar as a family home or other significant assets of a relationship are concerned, is theirs, and they don't want to share it. And in their words, the bitch can fuck off, but she's not going to get this. I'm not going to give it up. I've earned this. And it doesn't matter how much effort, how much time, how much sacrifice the female partner has made in terms of mothering children and keeping the house and doing all of the traditional roles in what may have perhaps been the traditional kind of marriage where he's worked and she stayed at home looking after children. That all kind of just gets diminished. The role of the female is just somehow extinguished as not really relevant, and the value of the bricks and mortar is all important to the male. Now, I'm generalizing, and I know that there'll be a number of your listeners who will be disagreeing with this, but I'm sure that the statistics will bear out that in times of marriage breakdown, separation, when property settlements are looming and decisions will be made perhaps by other people more fair-minded than the male, that's when women are really vulnerable, when they're in bad relationships.
Maybe it's not necessarily an issue of a generational issue among men per se, but more so just around the social dynamic and the working responsibilities of the male in the home at that point in time. So if they were working, they felt like they almost were the one that paved the way for the family home and all those assets that the family owned. And so in that sense or that train of thought, it's theirs theoretically, and that's the perception they had. Whereas now you look at a lot more opportunities for women. You only have to look at the NRLW and all these sporting opportunities for women these days, which is fantastic. So there's a lot more opportunity for them now. But it's quite a scary statistic that, like, the start of this year, we've had the highest rate of murders of women in, I think, Australia in years. Yet coercion has been now become a prisonable offence. So do you think we're going forward or backwards, or where do you think we are with this issue?
I think we're going forwards, but these homicide rates are just out of control, and the propensity of domestic violence, is still so dangerously high. You know, there's a huge amount of work that's being done, and rightfully so, to try to educate people to report domestic violence, to educate neighbours and strangers to help women in this situation, to demand of men that they um, um, meet standards that any civilized society must have. And it must be better in many ways because um, governments and police services and other um, groups dedicated to domestic violence are so much better educated and resourced than what they were. Um, you'll never eradicate it, of course. I mean, there are some lofty ambitions, and people talk about, uh, ending domestic violence. The sad reality is it's a bit like, the idea that we could end fraud or, end murder. I mean, it is unattainable. There will be red mists that just descend on um, people who have a propensity to hurt women, and probably the most that we can hope for is that more people act sooner to try to nip it in the bud when it's visible, when it's um, capable of being stopped and the perpetrator arrested and hopefully given a bit of a flogging on the way into the watch house um, before there is another fatality. And I think that the role of good male role models, coppers and prosecutors and others who work with domestic violence, um, and in the media, the role of men exposing other men who are harming women is or has never been more important.
Walk us through the typical process when you're starting a new investigation like Bronwyn, and what kind of legal loopholes and challenges do you typically face when you're trying to unravel these cold cases which have baffled authorities for years? What kind of things don't we see or hear when we listen to your podcast?
Well, what you don't see or hear is me doing whatever I can, haranguing people and making calls and sending emails and scouring archives to try to get every possible document, record, piece of paper, newspaper clipping, letter, memo, finding, everything that could be potentially relevant to a case that I've decided to take on. And I do this because I need to understand and read and reread and underline and circle and highlight things in these documents that I believe may be helpful to me long before I've tried to interview anybody. I believe that the best method for me, and it's probably different for others, but it works for me, is just hours and then days and sometimes weeks and weeks of just careful, reflective reading and rereading of the material until I feel like I know it really well. And then I'm just so much better off when I need to do the interviews that are going to be the mainstay, the the significant parts of the podcast series, because I'll know the detail at least as well as the person I'm interviewing. Sometimes I know it better. I know their statements and their evidence better than they do because they haven't thought about it for years. And I'm reading documents going back to, say, 1998 or 1985 or 1982 when they made those statements. They've forgotten a lot of this detail, but it's there in black and white. It's in recordings that were made at the time. It's in statements that they've signed off. So if I become so familiar with that material, I'm more confident when I'm doing an interview. I'm asking better questions. I'm potentially extracting more material and more answers than would have been thought possible. That's the first stage, and you don't hear that because that's kind of just part of the the dark art behind the scenes.
And how important is it in terms of your collaboration with law enforcement agencies? We heard a little bit about your interactions with Dr. Kirsty Wright and some of those important forensic officials and government officials, police, not only from the standpoint of maintaining your factuality in your reporting, but also in terms of engaging the audience emotionally and maintaining integrity in your work.
Yeah. I want to maintain independence as a journalist, and at the same time, I want to make sure that I can um, potentially help a law enforcement agency or a homicide unit if I get information that I think they really need to be onto as well. And that might sound a little bit conceited, what the journo podcaster thinks that he can help the homicide unit. But the reality is that a lot of people who listen to podcasts are not picking up the phone to talk to the cops, but they are sending me emails. They are sending me messages on Facebook or through the website for the podcast. And they're doing that because they feel like they've got a connection with the podcast or with me that that is important, that makes a lot of sense. And they don't care about Crime Stoppers. They don't know anyone at Crime Stoppers. They don't know cops in the homicide unit. So it does make a whole lot of sense that podcast journalists who have won trust and respect from their listenership will get information from people who haven't previously come forward. But I think we've got a really fundamental problem with the attitude of a lot of people involved in law enforcement. And I haven't put my finger on whether the attitude is the product of them being territorial. There's a view perhaps that their job as homicide cops or senior detectives wearing badges and having the right to carry guns is to investigate these murders, and a journalist with a microphone can just fuck right off.
Yeah.
Do they feel threatened potentially because we might get information that they're not getting? Well, we do that. We do get that information. Do they believe that we'll destroy their potential to solve a case by getting information that we then broadcast before they've had a chance to put operational tactics into play? Maybe that's probably part of it. I think that's a far-fetched scenario in most cases. My gut feeling is that they just haven't adjusted to a modern era where it makes a whole lot of sense for them, with proper protocols, to have dialogue, to build a bridge with a podcast, with a true crime series. It is, I think, just really weird that we haven't, for example, in the Bronwyn podcast series, been contacted by any senior representative of the New South Wales Police Force to say, hey, this case that you're working on, it's still an unsolved for us. Do you reckon we could provide someone from the New South Wales Police in an interview in one of your episodes talking about how we're really interested in this case, we're still looking at it, we have never given up, and that way some of your listeners who know stuff could contact that copper? I mean, that's just sort of, public engagement 101. It is so obvious. And none of the highly paid communications professionals, none of the senior officers of the New South Wales Police have thought about that. Or if they have thought about it, they've ruled it out. I don't need anything from the New South Wales Police. Like, I don't need them to give me anything. I don't ask them for anything. But I shake my head at the failure of them to say, why don't we utilize this podcast that is reaching so many more people than our Crime Stoppers ads, that has this sort of, yeah, that has this captive audience. Why don't we utilize it, see if we can get one of our detectives on there talking about the case, and we'll give him a really careful, controlled script so he doesn't stray off and blow anything up, and we might get something out of it. I mean, do you find that weird?
So I think it's a given. It should be a given, right? The fact the police cooperate with you to make sure that the correct and a proper way to approach things in terms of navigating your communication and your messages around the investigation, but also, as you say, just outreach.
I mean, if I've lost a loved one and I'm not a journalist, I'm just a listener to a true crime podcast, I think I'd be berating the senior detective, saying, mate, do you realize that this bloke's getting millions of downloads with this story about my sister or my daughter who's gone missing? Why aren't you on there talking about how police can contact you because you're running the task force that's investigating? Why aren't you in there? Why aren't you a presence in this podcast? How come you're completely invisible? What is wrong with you? You know, like, and because it's not it's not going to benefit my podcast to have that. Like, I don't say this because I really think there's a big hole in the storytelling and the cops aren't there. I just say it because I can't believe how this missed opportunity just isn't taken up to help victims of crime and their families.
Do you still think there's a long way for police to go before they get to I guess, I think a lot of the community, particularly in, I'd imagine, Queensland, but also New South Wales, have kind of lost a bit of touch with the police.
Yeah, look, I don't want to be
slander anyone.
No, it's not that. I support police, and I think police do a lot of really good work, and I, have enormous respect for a lot of police I've dealt with. So I guess I don't want to sound like I'm smearing, the police force as a whole. I'm not. I'm just against and baffled by the failure of police to take this amazing opportunity,
Yep.
which is true crime podcasting, and turn it to their advantage. It's like they're threatened by it, or they're jealous of it, or they're scared. I don't know. They intimidate. I don't know what it is. They would, I believe, grow as a more effective crime fighting organization if they took the opportunity, if they showed their commitment by saying, okay, what are the big true crime podcasts into Unsolved at the moment, and who can we roll out to be interviewed in them to enhance the story, but also improve our chances of getting information and tips from informants who have been quiet. It's great that these informants are talking to the podcast, but we want to channel some of them to us,
Yeah. But improve the standards of podcasting too. Maybe there's been things you've said in the past that you necessarily shouldn't have said. But by police jumping on board, they can kind of tighten up in that respect too.
Yeah.
So in terms of what you mentioned before about, I guess, social media and that kind of thing, there's been this massive boom in artificial intelligence. And I saw this really funny ad the other day on a billboard saying, AI is coming for your job, but it's not coming for your Nando's chicken or something of that nature. But I guess being a journalist and being in this field, one of the biggest fears, no doubt, I imagine, for a lot of people in media and journalism, but also a lot of other professions, is this incoming influx of new technologies and machine learning and that kind of thing, which potentially down the track will eradicate the need for some of these jobs. I guess you're quite fortunate in the fact that I imagine people love the personal nature of your podcasts and the work you do. So I definitely don't think your podcasting is under threat. But is there a concern, more broadly amongst a lot of journalists that AI is, there's that looming threat of AI?
I think there would be, pockets of concern about that. And I've thought about how it might affect true crime podcasting. I just can't see the robots being able to, do the kinds of interviews and analysis that I do. I did get a bit of a surprise, though, when I used Trent in a way that I hadn't used before. So for all of my audio, I put it through the Trent transcribing system, and I get, usually a pretty good result. I hasten to add, I'm not sponsored by Trent. I'm not trying to plug them or anything. But they had this new button that you could push to give you like an executive summary of your transcript, and I thought, oh, okay, so what, it's going to like interpret, a 1 hour interview and give me this little snapshot of it as a memo for myself. I'll see how that works. I was absolutely gobsmacked by, the accuracy of it. It was incredible, and it only took a matter of seconds. And I'm still amazed at the accuracy of these robots to turn a 1 or 2 hour recording into a very accurate, perfectly time coded transcript that would have taken a day when we have to transcribe our own files to do so. When we had tapes, oh my God, I'm still haunted by the noise of rewinding those tapes and trying to get the quote down, and we'd spend forever doing it, and then we'd only end up using about 3% of the actual content of the tape and the story, but it had taken a day to transcribe. Now, I just go and make a cup of tea or have a beer, and away the transcribing system goes. And now it's also giving me a memo that summarizes what's there in case I've forgotten. So that's got to be a good thing. But I worry about, every other potential application that could take real people's jobs.
So one of the things I also wanted to just chat to you about. So in Bondi, we had this stabbing recently at the Westfield in Bondi. And one thing I've noticed now is the proliferation of media on different outlets, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. And I've heard you publicly saying, a lot of journalists should be focusing more on working on refining the stories and how they communicate those stories, and less on their Twitter platform or their social media profiles. What kind of implications is social media having for the way that journalists, not just like yourself, but other journalists too, in the way that not only the community receive information, but also your role and your responsibility as a journalist?
Well, I think that the penetration of social media coinciding with the fracturing of mainstream media has been really, pernicious, and has damaged journalism and changed listening and viewing and reading habits fundamentally, such that, people apparently, in their teens and 20s now regard the news cycle as what they get out of TikTok. It used to be what they would read by scanning the pages of a, respected broadsheet newspaper, or listening to quality programs, whether it's on the ABC or some of the commercial free-to-air channels. And, the social media profiles of journalists, it seems to me, have been justified as a tool to distribute their journalism, and that's fair enough. But they've also, I believe, been a tool for journalists to, in some ways, even narcissistically curate their own profiles. So they've become um, more invested, and it doesn't certainly isn't the case for all journalists, but a number of journalists who have developed really strong social media followings, I believe, have done that to the detriment of their journalism, and they've been so invested and committed to uh, creating a profile for themselves online in social media that just to keep up with, the output that's required with, Twitter, what's now known as X, and to keep feeding this growing audience they have, there must be an impact on what they can actually produce in terms of journalism. Um, Tweeting isn't journalism. And if you're spending hours a day producing, tens of thousands of tweets a year, what's the actual upside? How is society benefiting from that? How are you actually producing quality journalism if you're too distracted by um, the social media profiles as a journalist to be practicing investigative journalism? So maybe I'm missing something here, but I just can't imagine how I could possibly get through the amount of work I have to do. And it's grueling when we're doing, a series such as The Teacher's Pet or Bromwell. The hours are punishing, just keeping up with um, the production deadlines and the writing and narrating and interviewing and so on. It's insane sometimes. But if you also heaped on top of that the uh, the demands that journalists have been meeting with social media, it wouldn't get done. I couldn't get it done. So, uh, I'm not a fan. I don't like Twitter. I think that it's been terrible for journalism. It's caused so many journalists to become publicly perceived as partisans, as activists. It's led to many journalists wearing their beliefs and their um, at times narcissistic tendencies, on their Twitter profiles, exposing them and their colleagues and outlets sometimes to ridicule. I don't know how many jobs it's destroyed because of the late night drunken tweets. Um, so, yeah,
Is there any KPIs around that kind of thing in the journalism profession? I imagine there's probably some outlets where journalists are promoted. For instance, in research, we're kind of pushed to have our X now, or Twitter formerly, username on our presentations, for instance, so that people can connect with our research or whatever. Is there that kind of push in journalism as well to have?
There was certainly at News Corp. I can't speak for other media outlets, but I suspect it was the same. There was certainly a view going back several years that it was a good thing. The view has changed, and I think people have understood that, or sensible people have understood that Twitter has to be managed very carefully because it can be really destructive and not beneficial at all. And I, perhaps because, as I said to you earlier, I'm not a natural convert to all technology stuff, but it's not just that. I just had a view that, for me, Facebook was really interesting when it started, and I still have a Facebook profile, although I don't really post on it anymore because it just seems to sort of be a more of a chore than a pleasure. I think that increasingly public companies and media outlets and journalists are going to sort of swing away. Um, I, I've got a feeling we've reached peak stupidity with the rush into Twitter, and that it's moving back to a more sensible balance. That's my hope. What's your sense of that? Or do you think?
Being a younger individual from a different generation, not many people are watching the news anymore. Not many people are consuming media other than through their social media. Whether I know that you're saying we're getting dumber, and I agree with that. I think as a society, definitely we're getting locked in our little echo chambers of our news feeds and things on social media, and that's I tried to escape that a little bit. But I think given the proportion of the population that is on social media, it makes sense for a lot of marketing agencies to be really attacking that
Yeah,
need. Yeah,
I agree. It makes a lot of sense to be able to market and distribute your stories and podcasts and news breaks and so on social media. And if it really were limited to that, that would be fine.
ideal. Yeah,
But what I've seen is that uh, a lot of people on Twitter just get sucked into the,
comments and things.
oh my God, they got to comment on so many different things. And then they end up in these sort of Twitter wars,
Yeah, they get
and
passionate.
then, oh, they get
I don't.
trolled.
I
And
don't really do that. I don't. To be honest, I don't really. I don't really like or comment on or anything. I just basically just post and get it to delete the app or get off it. That's all.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, that's the discipline you need, and that works. Yeah.
Um, Hedley, it's been an absolute pleasure of mine to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you.
I've been an avid listener, as I said at the start of your podcast, and I've had a lot of guests on the show, but today was a nice pivot away from some of the other topics we've been talking about some crazy endurance feats from some incredible people. But to get someone like yourself on the podcast today, it's been an absolute pleasure. Um, Before we kind of wind things up, I just want to talk a little bit about where you foresee investigative journalism going in the coming years. How is this area of journalism continuing to evolve, and what do you foresee for the future, particularly in relation to digital storytelling, but also podcasting?
Mm. I'm hoping that as a result of the outcomes of these true crime podcasts, like Shandee's story and exposing wrongdoing in the lab, and the teacher's pet, um, and others, others that have achieved amazing results, like you know, podcasts that have been done by friends and colleagues of mine who have really um, helped families and victims of crime get justice. That more outlets, more executives, more bean counters will appreciate the public's um, really strong demand for quality, detailed, well researched, deep diving examinations of cases, particularly cold cases. And that as a result, there'll be more commitment from the people who fund these, that there'll be more money available to help solve more unsolveds. And that's going to be a great thing. Uh, I know that a lot of people are um, increasingly fickle with the journalism that they consume. But what they want, in my experience, and what I've discovered they want through the podcasts I've been doing, is factual, interesting storytelling in cases where justice has not been served and might still be served with the help of members of the public, people coming forward, and committed journalism. That's got a really strong connection with people, as it should. And we can keep doing that and meeting that need And, if more media outlets are taking the risk and funding it, then, I reckon we'll all be a lot better off. That's where I hope we're going.
Is there, with Bronwyn, is there any other series on the horizon that you're working on?
I've got a lot in mind, but I figured that,
Can't disclose.
yeah, I look, yeah, I can't really talk about them. I don't want to put pressure on the people who want to help me if I talk about them early. Uh, Unfortunately, I can probably only take on one big one a year. Um, and yeah, because there's months of investigation and work before you release an episode. And, I've become a bit of a laughing stock within my own um, group of friends and colleagues because at the outset, I'll say, oh, look, I think this is going to be about 6 episodes. And they roll their eyes and double it. And, I've become kind of renowned for underestimating how these series will expand and grow. And the reason is people contact me and information is presented and produced as a result of people listening to early episodes. So my estimates are correct
Yep.
in the absence of that material. But these podcasts have such an impact on listeners who know stuff or who want to help that the information base just widens and deepens. And what am I meant to do? Say, oh, well, I estimated only 6 eps. I'm not going to investigate these new leads. We'll just forget about that and proceed to the finish line. No, you've got to just, squeeze every last bit out of these things to ensure that you might get the result.
So you mentioned that people can provide evidence. I won't say where can we find the podcast because if people scroll down on this episode on Spotify, wherever they're listening, they can find, I'll put all the links to The Night Driver, Shandee's story, The Teacher's Pet, The Teacher's Trial, and currently Bronwyn. But if people want to get in touch with you and provide evidence, where can they email Hedley?
Yeah, people find my email address at The Australian, and I've also got a website called hedleythomas.com, hedleythomas.com. And I get a lot of people who email me through that website.
Yep.
And it's a pretty, it's in keeping with my own um, um, lack of engagement with social media. If you go to it, there's not a lot there. I don't know how to update it, but there's an address there and a couple of photos and a bit of bio and so on. So it's really just a landing place, and I try to respond to everybody. I can't respond immediately because I've just got so much work on at the moment, but I do try to get back to everyone.
Just before we round things out, normally what we do, Hedley, is I have a playlist on Spotify where I get every guest to add one of their favorite songs to the playlist. So we have this ever-evolving playlist of music from our guests. Now, I think I'm going to do things a little bit differently today. I'm going to get you to recommend maybe if there's a podcast that you listen to that you would recommend other podcast fiends to indulge in.
You know what? I reckon it'd be easier for me to recommend a song because,
We can do both. Let's do both. Let's do one of each.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed the podcast going back a few years now of the Nixon years and the Watergate tapes. Now that was an American production, and there's a particular brand or podcast company that produced it. I thought it was amazing. I love that,
Yeah.
US political history. And do you remember it? Do you want me to try and find out? Do you want to see
Yeah,
if I
if
can
you know what, Hedley, if you can pull that up and
yeah, I'll see if I can find.
get Anna to email that across,
Yeah. Um,
put that in the
and
notes.
in terms of songs, I mean, I get excited every time I hear Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run. That's a favorite. Lately, I have been playing a lot of Murder on the Dance Floor.
Oh, great one. Yeah. Timeless.
Oh my God, the movie that I watched recently at home. The last few scenes just did my head in. So,
Oh, mate, it's been a pleasure, Hedley. Thanks so much for your time today. And I wish you all the best with Bronwyn.
thank you. I've enjoyed it a lot and appreciated your patience. And I'm sorry I couldn't come on sooner. It took a little while to schedule this one, but we got there.
No dramas at all.
Okay. Cheers, Hayden.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Normalist Podcast. If you enjoyed listening, please don't forget to rate the podcast or subscribe to our YouTube channel for more clips from each episode. You can also follow us on all social media platforms using the handle @Normalist Podcast.